Hi everyone. Today we're going to talk a little bit about the way that form can impact theme, specifically in Tim O'Brien's short story, The Things They Carried. So, as we talked about earlier this semester, there are certain formal elements of fiction, and we're going to focus on one of those formal rather than stylistic elements today. So, just to review, you have plot, character, point of view or narrator, and setting. As we talked about before, there are certain common expectations of plot that every person who's ever heard a story understands. It's that move from once upon a time to happily ever after that goes through exposition, rising action, climax, falling action, or denouement. Now, traditionally, the action or events of the story will match the story's emotional content. So if we think of a fairy tale that's well known, like Cinderella, the climax, that moment at the ball where she loses her slipper, becomes the most exciting and the biggest and most important event. It's also the most emotionally charged event because she's so close to what she's always wanted and it's taken away from her. So in The Things They Carried, the story frustrates the traditional understanding of plot. Now that you've read it, what you've realized is that the story kind of jumps around in time. It kind of flash forwards to events that have not been narrated yet, and then it goes back to events that happened in the past. So if traditionally the biggest event in a story is the climax, traditionally the biggest event in a war story would be a battle or a death. But this particular story makes the death, specifically Ted Lavender's death, into a bit of an afterthought. The first time we hear it is when the story tells us, in April, for instance, when Ted Lavender was shot, they used his poncho to wrap him up, then to carry him across the paddy, then to lift him into the chopper that took him away. In this first instance of being introduced to Ted Lavender's death, it's used actually as an example of how the ponchos are used, not as any kind of explication about the death itself. And even the very sentence structure undermines the importance of the moment. So if you take a look, when Ted Lavender was shot is this little tiny part of the sentence rather than the point of the sentence. So traditionally, you have the events matching the emotional context. Traditionally, the climax should be Ted Lavender's death. But it's not. So let's take a look at why it's not and what the story is doing with plot. So as I said, the first moment we see Ted Lavender's death is on page 368, and we get it introduced in the context of ponchos. The next time that we get Ted Lavender's death, the story tells us, but Ted Lavender, who was scared, carried 34 rounds when he was shot and killed outside Thang Cay, and he went down under an exceptional burden. So in this particular quote, we finally understand who Ted Lavender is, but he's not the heroic soldier we would expect. He's scared, and he goes down even heavier because he's carried extra ammunition in an attempt to not die. We hear him as an afterthought. Until he was shot, Ted Lavender carried a starlight scope, and this is part of a longer list of the many things that the platoon as a whole carries. We get the moment of his death. Right then, Ted Lavender was shot in the head on his way back from peeing. And again, the event of being shot is turned into this kind of afterthought or joke. Once that happens, we get after Ted Lavender has died. So after the chopper took Ted Lavender away on page 377. And then we get jokes about his death. They told stories about Ted Lavender's supply of tranquilizers, how the poor guy didn't feel a thing, how incredibly tranquil he was on page 380. And then you get more of an afterthought on the morning after Ted Lavender died. So if we take a look at the way that the story mentions Ted Lavender's death, what you'll notice is the actual moment when he's shot, the moment we get the most information about his death, is in the center of the story. It lines up with that overall plot structure. So exposition, we learn he's been shot, information about his death builds, the death occurs, the deaths turn into a joke, and the troops move on and war goes on. If we mapped the story out in terms of the death being the climax, it would actually work. The first two are flash forwards, which disrupts our usual once upon a time chronology, but in general, it hangs together pretty well. The problem is this is not really an emotionally satisfying plot because the story of his death is already over, and also because there's no change. So we talked about earlier this semester, plot is built on conflict. There's a character that is up against some sort of struggle, and that conflict drives change. So either the character meets the struggle and changes, or meets the struggle and doesn't change, and that change or lack of change is what plot is built on. So the question for the story becomes, where do we see a change? The biggest change in the story, if you've read it, is not in Ted Lavender, because Ted Lavender is already dead when the story starts, but in First Lieutenant Jimmy Cross. So let's take a look at those opening lines of the story. First Lieutenant Jimmy Cross carried letters from a girl named Martha, a junior at Mount Sebastian College in New Jersey. They were not love letters, it tells us. And it goes on for about 2 to 3 paragraphs about these letters, about how he spent hours pretending that she loved him, even though he knew that she didn't, about how she never mentioned the war, about how he understood that love was only a way of signing, and that he wondered if she was a virgin. So this is a really weird way to start what is ostensibly a war story. And the question becomes, how does this relate to the other plot, the one that should be important for a war story, which is Ted Lavender's death? The answer comes if we follow the change and the development of Lieutenant Cross's story. So let's take a look at how that works. So, as I said, in that opening paragraph, Lieutenant Cross understood that love was only a way of signing and did not mean what he sometimes pretended it meant. This is a really important quote because it shows he's not delusional. This is not a kid who has his head so far up in the clouds he doesn't know what's real. From the very beginning, he understands that Martha doesn't love him, that the love Martha that she signs is just the same as sincerely or best wishes, but that he pretends it means something. And that imaginary life is going to become really important to the story. So when Lavender dies, it was a bright morning in mid-April. Lieutenant Cross felt the pain. He blamed himself. Ted Lavender was dead because he loved her, Martha, so much and could not stop thinking about her. When we get to the point where they're going along through their hikes, he tells us, or the narrator tells us, he would slip away into daydreams, just pretending, walking barefoot along the Jersey shore with Martha, carrying nothing. Now, the carrying nothing is important here because that's as much of a fantasy as Martha is. Remember, the title of the story is The Things They Carried, and the story spends a lot of time detailing the overwhelming and often sometimes unrealistic weight of the many things that these soldiers carry. So the fact that he's able to walk barefoot along the shore without carrying a single thing is in a lot of ways just as important that he's daydreaming about the girl. At the moment Lavender dies, we find out he's still dreaming about Martha. Lieutenant Cross gazed at the tunnel, but he was not there. He was buried with Martha under the sand in New Jersey. And it goes on later to tell us he was 24 years old. He couldn't help it. So that what we get here is his daydreams as something that he couldn't stop. They're a defense mechanism. He takes himself out of the boredom and the tediousness and the danger of battle because in part he's young, because in part he doesn't want to be there, and because in part he can't help but doing it. After Lavender dies, he tried not to cry, he felt shame, he hated himself. And this is really kind of the beginning of the turning point. What he does from this point on will determine who he becomes. So let's take a look at how that works. When he's crying, the men all seem to think he's crying for Ted Lavender, but our narrator, who is an omniscient narrator, tells us something more. He tells us that in part, Lieutenant Cross was grieving for Ted Lavender, but mostly it was for Martha and for himself, because she belonged in another world which was not quite real. So this is a really interesting moment where the story stops us from believing in reality and unreality. This world he's created that Martha lives in, this pristine world on the New Jersey shore where she exists, is in fact a real place. She is a real girl, but in the situation he's in, that world doesn't even exist. That world might as well be a fantasy. And once he realizes that his fantasies about her might have cost Lavender his life, we get the quote, "There was a new hardness in his stomach. He loved her, but he hated her. No more fantasies," he told himself. And this corresponds to the line on 377 that says that his shame was like a stone in his stomach. Finally, at the very end, we get his final transformation. He's thrown Martha's letters away and burned them. He's tossed away the small stone she sent him, and he says he would be a man about it. He would show strength, distancing himself. He would dispense with love. So we've started this story with Lieutenant Cross in love with a girl named Martha, obsessing about the idea of love, believing in the idea of love. As the rising action happens, Cross is distracted by daydreams about her that are in part fanciful, are in part a defense mechanism, but they're the thing that keeps him going through his marches. At the climax, when Ted Lavender is shot, it lines up. Ted Lavender shot, and he feels shame. For the first time, he realizes that maybe these daydreams are something more than just a way to get through. And at that moment, because he sees shame, because he feels guilt about what happens, everything else has to happen the way it does. He blames himself and sees his love for her as the reason for Ted Lavender's death. And he decides to be a man and dispense with love as they go marching on. Now, this change is really important because while it's clear he's the leader of the platoon, it is not clear that it is in any way his fault. After all, there's an entire platoon of men who don't see the sniper, who don't realize they're in any danger. And while he's in charge of these men, he's also a 24-year-old kid stuck in the middle of a jungle. What's important is that he takes this responsibility and that he changes because of it. So the story's making a subtle argument. The death of Lavender is bad, but throughout the story it's made into an afterthought or a joke. The death of Cross's love, however, is not a joke. It's probably the most serious part of this entire story, so that the death of his love and the death of his capacity to dream or to love is what becomes tragic. Will he be a better leader? We don't know. They could go marching off and he could be the next General Patton or the next Eisenhower. The bigger question, though, is that whatever your reading of his transformation is going to help you get to your interpretation of the story. And there's a lot of ways to look at this. You could look at this as the loss of innocence is an equally important tragedy than death, or the loss of innocence is a more important tragedy than death. You might say that the innocent cannot lead in war, and what does that mean? So there's a lot of different ways that you could approach this final ending. But the important thing to remember is when we're getting to meaning, one of the ways we can do that is to look at form. So theme plus form will lead us to meaning, that there are certain expectations for those formal elements. And when we see a story changing them, pivoting away from them, doing something unexpected with them, there might be a way to get to meaning. So if we think about the things they carried theme as the effects of war, the form and the formal element we're dealing with is that the traditional plot structure is frustrated and changed and kind of dismantled here. Action is replaced by emotion. And if we put those two things together, one of the ways we can see the things they carried is to see it as an argument that the emotional impact of war is just as important as the action of battlefield, that the emotional deaths are just as devastating as the literal bodily deaths. So hopefully this gave you one way into the things they carried. If you have any questions about this or about any of the assignments, be sure to post them in the Ask the Professor discussion board.